Turn to Isaiah 46, in case that's not readily apparent there. I had quite the recurring dream last night where I would get up here and have absolutely nothing to say, so much so that it would wake me up because I had nothing to dream. So, if it sounds like I'm trying to fill in gaps, it's because my dream is coming true and that's not a good thing. One of the reasons, every time I would wake up, I would pull open my phone and look at my news feed for a particular source that I follow, because if you've been paying attention at all to any of the news in the Middle East, you would be aware that within this last week, things got really interesting over there with the use of everything from rockets and airstrikes to pagers and radios blowing up. And that basically was a event that then springboarded into another event, which springboarded into another event, and as of the last 48 hours, Hezbollah, which is based in Israel's north, has been launching hundreds of rockets at Israel's northern borders, getting a little farther in, and Israel has been retaliating with an unknown number of airstrikes. And so basically that's all to say that things are very interesting and very loud. If you were in Israel right now, especially the upper part of Israel, you would be likely staying near bomb shelters, and they were given out guidelines to not gather in large public groups and to stay near the shelters in the event of an alarm. So things are really interesting, and that's kind of a fun way to start off this morning. But before I get into charts and timelines, I wanted to start by getting into a question that I think we don't, or at the very least, we need to ask ourselves more often. It's very similar to how I approached the gospel. Was, okay, you say you're a Christian, you say you believe the gospel, but if I were to give you a pen and paper and say, okay, then write out for me what is the gospel, how many pieces of paper would you need? What text would you go to? Where do you think you would find the gospel in the New Testament? Where would you start as a basis of the bad news and then going into the good news? How would you explain it to somebody? And the reason I like that exercise is because that makes us stop and do a little introspection of, okay, how much do I know? I don't think we spend a lot of time self-critiquing in that regard because we're not often faced with a challenge. Most of the time, the most challenge you'll face in regards to the gospel is somebody coming up and just outright saying, I don't believe in God, gospel's dumb, or some absurd extreme like that, as though you're in some sort of Christian movie, where the bad guy's obviously bad and the atheist's obviously atheist, and we never really face much of a challenge there. So in the same way that we ought to be critiquing how we explain the gospel, or even how we think about it, the same thing applies for the end of the age. If I said, okay, and we'll get to this a little later, but if I said, how long is the Great Tribulation? Most people will say, oh, that's easy, it's 3.5 years. And I say, okay, where does it say that? And you might think, oh, well, let's go to Matthew 24. Matthew 24 does not tell you at all, in any way, the length of time. Oh, well, let's go to Revelation. Revelation doesn't use the term Great Tribulation. Well, where in Daniel might you look? And then you start with Daniel 1, and then you go into Daniel 2. Oh, there's Nebuchadnezzar's image. And you read Daniel 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, and it's just biographical accounts and Nebuchadnezzar and all that fun stuff. And then it's not till chapter 7 that you reach some image of beast. And again, my point with that is to simply say that the question is easy as it seems to answer off the top of your head. If I asked you to prove it, how would you do that? It's not to say you're wrong, and it's not to say you're right. It's to say, have we thought through it? So the point of this exercise is to kind of go through this point by point for a few different basics, and I'm not going to cover all the bases. I'm not going to cover all the intersecting texts because that would take a lot longer. But what we will do is give kind of a very basic overview of some fundamentals, and I do view these as fundamental ways to understand this topic. But Isaiah 46, the reason I wanted to start here is because it really brings, I think, to the forefront. If I were to ask you the question, why do these things happen? You know, we talk about the end and the apocalypse and Revelation and the end of the age, and we kind of speak about it in generic terms. We think, oh, well, there's debate about the rapture, but, you know, things will get bad. Weird things will happen in the sky. Maybe there's earthquakes. people will get really evil, and then some shadowy figure called Antichrist will show up. Again, if I said, all right, prove it, where would you go? It would probably astonish some to realize that the term Antichrist is only ever used twice in the entirety of the Bible. And both of them are used by John, but not in Revelation. They are used in 1 John and 2 John, and that's it. And they don't talk about some shadowy figure leading the nations. It doesn't talk about it that way. So there's a lot of things we just assume and we don't think through, and that's what we're going to get through today. But when we ask the question, why do these things happen? Or more specifically, why does the day of the Lord happen the way it does? Why not just stop? Why not just break the clouds open, Jesus comes down, kicks all the bad guys out, and brings in his kingdom? Why not do it that way? Why not send all the bad guys to hell and all the good guys to heaven, blow up the current earth, make a new one, and that's that? Why not make it quick and efficient and obvious and simple? Unless there's a different point to it. And there will be a couple of points that we will get into, but one of the first and most primary points that you have to understand when you're reading through these texts and asking, why is this happening this way? Why is it complicated? Why are there so many specifics and intersecting points and explanations and reasons? Why Israel? Why are they constantly showing up? Isaiah will explain this. I love this text because it narrows down why we do any of this, why we pursue to understand any of this. Starting at verse 1. Bel has bowed down and Nebo stoops over. These are idols. Their images are consigned to the beasts and the cattle. So their closest likeness are animals. The things that you carry are burdensome, a load for the weary beast. Your idols have weight. They're hard to pick up and move around. They stooped over. They have bound down together. They could not rescue the burden, but have themselves gone into captivity. These idols could not help the Israelites. They certainly couldn't help the pagans. They were useless. They were just dead weight. Listen to me, O house of Jacob, and all the remnant of the house of Israel, you who have been born by me from birth, and have been carried from the womb, even to your old age, I will be the same. And even to your graying years, I will bear you. I have done it, and I will carry you. And I will bear you, and I will deliver you. Notice the emphasis. Who's doing all of these things? And this is really going to build off of this here. There's a reason it's called the day of the Lord and not the day of the Christian. It's not the day of the prophets. It's not the day of Israel. Verse 5. To whom will you liken me, and make me equal and compare me, that we would be alike? Those who lavish gold from the purse and weigh silver on the scale hire a goldsmith, and he makes it into a god. They bow down, indeed they worship it. They lift it upon the shoulder and carry it. They set it in its place, and it stands there. It does not move from its place. Though one may cry to it, it cannot answer. It cannot deliver him from his distresses. And this is something I think we see in the world especially today. Despite all their enthusiasm and good intentions and hopes and dreams and all the silly things that they do, all the false gods, including false variations of Christianity, are useless, especially in the face of where the world is going. Verse 8, remember this and be assured. So this is going to be the answer to all the distresses and all the burdens and all the problems. And he's speaking to Israel in the context of captivity and being taken into exile and persecution and more than all of those things, their own sin. So remember this and be assured. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things long past. For I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is no one like me. Declaring the end from the beginning. So it was already planned as soon as it started. Declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things which have not been done. Saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my purpose from a far country. Truly, I have spoken. Truly, I will bring it to pass. I have planned it. Surely, I will do it. Listen to me, you stubborn-minded, who are far from righteousness. I bring near my righteousness. It is not far off. And my salvation will not delay, and I will grant salvation in Zion and my glory for Israel. So the primary purpose, the primary answer to the question of why do these things happen the way they are is because God said he would do it and he will do it. And the reason we have so many specifics and so many details and so many charts and days and times and images and representations and explanations and prophecies is because God is detailed and he gets it right down to the exact dot that he means it to. And in exactly such a way that it couldn't be anybody else. Even as we approach the first day of fall here today, he's thinking about the Christmas account. It's the exact same thing, that you had this almost paradox of two different things colliding. On the one hand, specific prophecies and expectations of what the Messiah would be and when he would come and where he would come and how he would come, and then it would funnel you into very specific conclusions, and you would think with all these things, how did they miss it? Why did so many people not know about it? So you had all these specifics, but when he was born, it was done in such a way, in such a time, with such detail, that it could not have been anybody else doing it. That down to the exact number from cursed generations and denials to the throne as to why Joseph had to be legally his father, but not biologically his father, all of these things lining up to an exact moment in time, or you could say the fullness of the time. Why he had to be born of a woman, why he couldn't just immediately come into existence and be a king. All those specifics lined up at exactly the right point, and it will happen again. All to illustrate who is doing this and why. So the primary point is that God is the one behind this, and if God's the one behind this, then you would expect it to be extremely detailed. So, that's the first reference. You can go to Daniel 9:24, the explanation behind why these 70 weeks occur. We've gone through that before. One of the primary functions is to make an end of sin and to stop the transgression and to bring in everlasting righteousness. So he's going to deal with that, but that even was given as a response to Daniel's prayer for freedom from their exile. Because Daniel had remembered they would leave Babylon after 70 years, and so he prays for that freedom, and the response given was far more widespread than the initial request. Romans 11, going back to the point regarding Israel's salvation, one of the key points there that is given by Paul is that God keeps his promise. He does not have to make it symbolic, and Paul goes out of his way, I think, to make it obvious that he's not speaking symbolically, that he is speaking quite literally about his people, and that God would deliver them, that he would save them, that from Zion would come their salvation, even Isaiah is alluding to here, and all Israel would be saved, despite the fact that not all Jews were categorized as the redeemed Israel there. And so that's the other purpose, that the day of the Lord would accomplish that goal. And then in Revelation 22. In Revelation 22, you can read Revelation 22. I don't think I'm going to have enough time for that right now, but if you read through it, effectively what you're reading is at the very end of the book, the very end of the whole thing. If I simply went to Revelation 22, and I didn't tell you what I was reading out of, and I just started explaining that text, you might think, oh, well, that must be an epistle. Some note of encouragement and an explanation behind, don't worry, all the bad stuff that's happening to you, your finances and your relationship problems and the politics, don't worry, God has this all planned out. But this was at the tail end of Revelation. After all these strange and chaotic things go down, then he caps off the whole thing by stating that he is the beginning, he is the end, he is the Alpha, the Omega. This is his plan, this is what he will accomplish. And then, of course, the call by John and the others in that group to come, having seen everything they had seen. And so Revelation, I think, caps off the reason why the day of the Lord happens the way it does, is because God is going to do what he said, even in all the imagery and the prophecies and visions and so on. So, God has a very specific plan which he will carry out exactly as has been planned, accomplishing his promises to save Israel, bring his kingdom physically to the earth, and bring an end to the reign of sin. This is the reason why it happens the way it does. It's not just about beating the devil. It's not just about bringing us to heaven. It's so much more than that. And I think we can be grateful that it's so much more than that. In fact, I heard someone else speaking on the question of Israel, and he was saying, if you want a sort of monument, a testimony to the faithfulness of God to keep his word, look no farther than the nation of Israel. Because you can, and when I was speaking at the mission, I said, you read the Bible and you see all these terrible people doing terrible things. You hear of, who's a righteous person in the Bible? Well, let's go look at King David. He never messed up. Certainly not more than once. He kind of did. All right, well, let's go to the prophets. They were all just flawless people. I mean, most of them seem disinterested in continuing their job. They seem to have to be dragged across the finish line with Jeremiah. Okay, let's go to the New Testament. Peter the apostle, right? The one that Jesus, he gave his declaration of faith that he believed that he was the Son of God. And so Peter never messed up. Well, he messed up, and he's one of the most well-documented mess-ups in the New Testament. All right, well, Paul, well, we know who he used to be. I mean, you can find person after person after person. And so Israel is one of the I think, personifications of that faithfulness. So much so that they're in the news this morning and yesterday and all of last week, and they have been for the last 70-plus years. I think, personally, it is the most difficult time in the world to be any form of preterist. I don't know how you look at not just a nation called Israel, but exactly where it is, built up of more Jews than have been in that land at any point in the last 2,000 years, and you say, oh, well, incidental. But the benefit for us is not just some debate tactic. Benefit for us is it means, okay, so we can see right now, you can pull it up on Google if you want to, God's faithfulness is still active. It's not changed, it's not wavered, and it's still going on. So, all that now to get into our first part here. And I'm going to try to go through these one step at a time to build up a timeline. By the end of it, it's going to look a little complicated, and this is a bare bones version. You've seen my very complicated chart, and this is an extremely watered down version of the same thing. But before we get into that, we're going to talk about what Dad mentioned earlier, anchoring points. And anchoring points are our way to make sense of different texts. So take Daniel alone, which we'll get into. There are at least a handful, you could say 4, maybe 5 different timelines you could draw up that Daniel gives in different chapters. So each one you would think, oh, okay, so if he's talking about the same thing, then they'll all look identical. But they seem to each be different. And I'm not going to cover every single chapter in Daniel. I've done that before. But suffice it to say, what we're going to try to do is draw out by each text what it said would happen, a very basic order of events, and then we're going to line them up. But the way we line them up is to look for anchoring points. So the first one would be what I call primary anchors. And I'm making these terms up, so if this intersects with some other point of philosophy, I'm sorry, I don't care. Primary anchoring points are basically to say, these are obvious things. They're obviously speaking about the same things. So, for example, one of the main ones we're going to deal with is the regular sacrifice being stopped. And this one shows up approximately 4 different times in the Old Testament, which is, I think, fascinating because all of them come from Daniel, but not all in the same chapter. And so it clearly goes out of its way to talk about regular sacrifice being stopped. And you would think that's some small, minute detail. But that is the one that reoccurs. It shows up in Daniel 8, it shows up in Daniel 9, it shows up in Daniel 11, and it shows up in Daniel 12. And so you can take that very specific event and use that to line up the other charts. So those would be primaries, things that are obviously speaking about the same thing. The other would be like the abomination of desolation. Secondary anchors are what I would basically call assumptions, or you could kind of fill in the gaps. So they're not directly stated. So for example, on this little example chart, you might say that 0.5 is never mentioned on the first line there. But based on the positions of the primary points, we can assume that it happens after 0.4. Or point A and B, they're only ever mentioned in one timeline, but they are tied around other primary anchoring points, so we can kind of guess as to where they would fall in certain events. So, for example, and we'll get into this, Daniel chapter 9, where we get our 70th week, it alludes to the abomination of desolation, but it never tells you when it happens. It just alludes to it. It says, effectively, it's coming, and then it ends. But Daniel 11 and Daniel 12 tell us exactly when it would happen. So, and by the way, that we'll get into is tied to that regular sacrifice being cut off. So we can safely assume, as to the abomination of desolation, we can start to line up where it would be. And when you've tied up these primary and secondary anchoring points, you can then do the most fun part, which is putting them all together into one simplistic chart of saying, all right, so here, based on everything we've looked at, are the order of events. Some of them, the little blue dots there, might move. I don't know exactly where those would be. But they're somewhere in there. They're at least, A is at least safely sandwiched between 1 and 2. So this is an illustration of how you can kind of break these points down to say, all right, here's how I can make sense of 5 or 6 different explanations of the same thing. And this doesn't just work for timelines. You can use this for even points of theology. So, like referring to the gospel, how did the New Testament preachers give the gospel? What order of things did they find important to mention in a specific order? And what things did they move around? It's a similar way of trying to problem solve how is the best way to look at a particular issue. So, these are how we handle anchors. So our first text is Daniel chapter 9, and we will go there. I am not going to spend an awful lot of time in each of these texts. I just kind of want to give a sort of basic overview of what's said about them. And each of these texts, so Daniel 9, 11, 12, 8, Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians 2, and Revelation, these are just some of the ones that we're going to line up. And they're very basic versions of these. But this is how we're going to build up a sort of explanation behind the events that are happening. So, Daniel chapter 9, most of Daniel chapter 9 consists of 2 things. The first and most primary point is Daniel's prayer. You notice it doesn't begin with the 70 weeks. That doesn't show up to the last few verses. It starts with Daniel recognizing that they were in Babylonian captivity. He remembered what the prophet Jeremiah had written as to how long they would be there. So he goes into his room like he had done before and starts praying. All right, God, you said this would happen. Make it happen. That's one thing. But his motive for saying that was in repentance. You read Daniel chapter 9, the first parts there, and I think it is a very worthwhile read because it's so easy to skip over and go right down to the bottom. But what Daniel is showing, and he didn't even seem to realize it, was why it was going to happen the way it was and why the answer from God is more wide-sweeping than he thought it would be. But in Daniel chapter 9, getting down to that interesting part, Gabriel, the angel, shows up and gives him the response. This is the same Gabriel that gave Mary her message. And in verse 24, he's going to start describing things that for us are past, but for Daniel, we're still future. 70 weeks, or more literally 77s, have been decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. And when we talk about 77s, weeks is an unfortunate translation because we think 7 days, but it doesn't say days, it just says 70 groups of 7s. Now you might think, okay, well, why not say 490 years? Why say 77s as opposed to 490 years? And that's to basically say that God has segmented out into chunks. And this will then help us as we get to the very end here. So, verse 25, and he's going to notice this, how specific he is. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince comes, there will be 7 7s and 62 7s. And it will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. So we put those numbers together, and you have 69 70s, or 7s, all grouped together. So we're 1 shy. Then after the 62 7s, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. Okay, well, that's clearly the crucifixion. Then after he's cut off and have nothing, the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Now note how this goes here. He doesn't say they will destroy the city and the sanctuary. All right, well, we can look at least some explanations behind the events that occurred in 70 AD and say, all right, well, there it is. You would think he would go from there and then say, if we were preterists, he would kind of skip that next part and go straight into then the last part, but he doesn't. So after these things and after the Messiah is cut off, they destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood, and even to the end, there will be war, desolations are determined. So this is almost a sort of ... as opposed to, all right, city is destroyed, Messiah is cut off, and all the way to the end, desolations are determined, there's war, there's conflict. Now, that should ring a bell for you, and we'll get to that in a minute. When we say there's wars and conflicts, or wars and rumors of wars. Now, verse 27, we have one more group of 7 left, 1 week. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. There's our primary anchor. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. End. End of the chapter. End of the vision. We think, oh, well, hang on, where does it say 7-year tribulation? I thought for sure I'd find that there. And as we'll show in a minute, this 7-year covenant is only ever mentioned here. That's it. Notice what it doesn't say. So when we look at this chart, we know how it begins, right? And this is a very easy thing to do. You can kind of draw this out and say, right, it starts the last week when a covenant is made with the many. You can debate as to what the covenant is, who it's made with. It does not say Israel. It just says the many, the group of peoples. So it doesn't really narrow down the nature of the covenant. Okay, well, you can speculate on that, but you can't be dogmatic. So we know it lasts 7 years. And, using very basic math, we know that half of 7 years is 1,260 days, or 3.5 years. Now, this is where things get confusing for a lot of people. You would think if I said 3.5 years, there should only be one, maybe two. But if I told you there were 3 different time chunks that consist of 3.5 years, then it gets a little more complicated. But we'll start here. So halfway through, a stop is put to sacrifice. The Greek Septuagint only includes sacrifice. It doesn't mention grain offering, but the idea is that the normal sacrifice that would be going on in the temple is stopped. So some sort of deal is made with some groups of people, and halfway through, an order is issued to stop sacrifices. And then on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. So the abomination of desolation is going to be coming. And then yes. And so if you were Daniel, you'd written that down and think, all right, well, regular sacrifice, which we will get into in a minute, was mentioned in Daniel 8, so the previous chapter. So he's already heard about that part. And we'll explain where that fits in a little later. But the abomination of desolation is something new. That was not mentioned in Daniel 8. This is the first time you ever hear of it. So Daniel 9 is a very basic chart. 7 years, halfway through, sacrifice is stopped. Not a lot to put there. So we then go to Daniel 11. Daniel 10 is a whole discourse on something else. It's not exactly a vision per se. That's a whole other category. But Daniel 11 mentions the abomination and the sacrifice again. And so if you go over to Daniel 11, you'll notice that, again, the first massive chunk of the chapter is just this back and forth. Kings of the north and south. It starts with Greeks and the Persians, and then north, south, north, south, north, south, north, south, north, south. And it constantly does this all the way down towards the latter part of the book. And something interesting to note is it only ever relegates these kings that are going back and forth in the majority of the chapter, all the way to the last king, by their direction. Which is interesting because he starts off by mentioning Greece and Persia, and then talks about the end of the Greeks. And then he stops naming them. He stops naming the countries, and he just starts referring to them by their direction. And you can assume as to what that might mean, but it doesn't tell you. Now, going to the very end, in verse 21, this is the last king in the book. And this, if you know anything about eschatology in the text, some of this should start to sound familiar. So we'll quickly go through it. In his place, that is in the place of the previous king, one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom, yet within a few days he will be shattered, though not in anger and battle. Well, there goes that king. But in his place, a despicable person will arise, in verse 21, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred. So in other words, he's ruling, but he's not titled king. But he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant, so he rises to power very quickly. After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder and booty and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. And he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war, but he will not stand. 4 schemes will be devised against him. Those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. And as for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table. But it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. And then the king of the north will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. And this is an interesting mention. Not just a covenant, but the holy covenant. So something bothers him about it. He's set against it. And he will take action and then return to his own land. At the appointed time, he will return and again come into the south. But this time it will not turn out the way it did before. For ships of Kittim, or modern-day Cyprus, will come against him. Therefore, he will be disheartened. Now, here's where we see this distinct change in character. He will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the Holy Covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. And by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant, but the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by the sword, by flame, by captivity, and by plunder for many days. And it goes on, and then in verse 36, the king will magnify, or will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done, and it goes on. So there's a lot of specifics, and this is why I wanted to keep this chart simple, because when I first started drawing out Daniel 11, I was already filling up most of the page, and I thought, this is not going to help. So I wanted to read through it so you can see there's a lot of detail that goes into it. But our anchoring points that are consistent, at least two of them, there are others, but two of our consistent points are sacrifice being cut off and the abomination of desolation. Now we get into Daniel 12. Daniel 12 is a continuation of Daniel 11. It's the same vision. But Daniel 12 does something very helpful. Because up to this point, if you were Daniel, and again, New Testament hasn't been written yet. So if you're Daniel, and you are paying attention and you're writing these things down, there's still the question of how these things link. And Daniel 12 really sets the basis for how we understand everything that's going on here. Because if you go to Daniel 12, it's short, but notice how specific he gets here. Verse 1, now having spoken about the king rising to power and the abomination, and he exalts himself and he thrives and he's just ruling effectively most of the nations. Verse 1, now at that time, Michael, the great prince, or this is Michael the archangel, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, Israel, will arise, and there will be, see if this sounds familiar, a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time, and at that time your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words, and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. So you'd think, all right, close the book, seal it up, all done. But Daniel, being persistent the way he is, in verse 5, and then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others were standing. So he's told to seal it up, and he hasn't quite sealed it. He notices two others standing, one on this bank of the river, and the other on that bank of the river, so on two different sides of rivers. And one said to a man dressed in linen, who was floating above the waters of the river, how long will it be until the end of these wonders? Here's the question. How long does this last? This time of distress and Michael arising and the salvation and this abomination of desolation and this king thriving. How long? And I heard the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, as he raised his right hand and his left towards heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. Literally, that translates to a year, 2 years, and half a year, which you put together would be 3.5 years. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all of these events will be completed. But as for me, I heard, but could not understand. So I said, my Lord, what will be the outcome of these events? What's the point? What's the end goal here? And you see this a lot even with other texts. The angel doesn't go, oh, let me answer your question exactly as you hope I answer it. And he says, go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end time. Many will be purged, purified, and refined, but the wicked will act wickedly. And none of the wicked will understand, but those who have insight will understand. And then he gives Daniel a little nugget here, something to hang on to. Verse 11, from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. And then he adds, how blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days. But as for you, go your way to the end. Then you will enter into the rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. Close the book. That's done with Daniel. So that's interesting. So let's put those together. So 1,290 days. If you read your Bible, or if you open up a Bible app and you search 1,260, it will come up empty. Never at any point does it say 1,260. So you might ask, why do I have 1,260 marked here? And that is purely because of Daniel 12, was to make sense of it. Because 1,290 is only mentioned once. And again, it's linking our anchoring points. When the sacrifice is stopped to when the abomination of desolation is set up, 1,290 days. We know that the regular sacrifice is stopped when? Halfway through the 7-year covenant, which the latter half would be 1,260 days. Well, if you're like me, and if you like simple math, subtract 1,290 or subtract 1,260 from 1,290 and you get 30 days, which would mean that the abomination of desolation is not set up until 30 days after the end of the 7-year covenant. And that, when I first came across it, I thought, that one, it would get me in a lot of trouble with a lot of circles, because most people believe that the Great Tribulation, and I'm going to use my mouse here for this, most people believe that the Great Tribulation is effectively this whole section here. So they believe everything that happens in the end goes down there. The problem with that is I could not find a text that says that, because they're basing it entirely off of Daniel 9 and the 7-year covenant. But the 7-year covenant mentions very little, except when the regular sacrifice is cut off. And then Daniel 12 says, hey, from that point until the time the abomination is set up, there's 1,290 days, which means the abomination of desolation doesn't get set up until 30 days after the 7-year covenant has come and gone. Okay, well, what relevance does that have? Well, Daniel 12 gives us a clue by saying, and we'll get into this when we get to Matthew 24, Daniel 11 mentions the abomination and what the king does in exalting and magnifying himself and thriving. And if you remove the chapter break, you'll see the abomination kicks off. This king of the north is just doing exceptionally well. Just all kinds of power, and he is arrogant, just like you'd expect him to be. But at that time, Michael, the archangel, stands up, and there is a time of distress. You could say a time of great distress. You could say a time of great tribulation. And using the same wording that Jesus uses in Matthew 24, Daniel 12 uses the exact same wording, such as never has occurred before. This is unprecedented distress. This is unprecedented tribulation. And so we already have, just looking at Daniel, an explanation of the timelines, of how these things go down. We haven't even gotten to Matthew 24 yet. So, moving on, one other question I wanted to address. That phrase, that one boggled my mind for a bit, because I thought, there is no other mention of that amount of time. And if you put the timeline together, you would think it would end at the end of the Great Tribulation, because Jesus comes back, and it would make sense to say, you're blessed if you make it that far. But he doesn't do that. It's well short of when the Great Tribulation ends. Because when the question is asked, how long do these things occur, he's told a time, times, and half a time, or 3.5 years. That's how long the Great Distress would occur, the Great Tribulation. And we have other texts for that, but that's how long it occurs. And this is just not getting you through it. So why would you be blessed if you keep waiting to that point? What benefit does it have? Now, I will tell you, I have speculation as to that answer. I do not have anything dogmatic because I could not find anything dogmatic. This is only mentioned here and nowhere else. So, doing some basic math, it's 45 days into the Great Tribulation. It's a month and a half. It's not very long. So, why are you blessed if you get 45 days into the end of the world, as it were? Because he's saying here that you are blessed if you can get there. And my best answer, tied into how I was handling Revelation, if you remember the fifth seal, what was happening when the fifth seal was broken? Well, you have the martyrs under the altar, and they're saying, how long until you avenge our blood? And Christ tells them to wait a little while longer, until what? The remainder of your brethren, who are to be slain, even as you, have come in. And then he would avenge them. And so the conclusion that I came away with from that text, and from basic logic looking at the rest of the text, is the persecution that seems to occur leading up to this event seems to end there. Because it was no other explanation as to why you'd be blessed if you make it that far. Because if you say, well, speaking of the ethnic Jews don't have it good. It's going to get a lot worse. So that's well farther past this point. So as far as I can tell, especially since it's in the context of speaking of those who have insight or understanding, it seems to indicate that if you can make it 45 days into the Great Tribulation, you'll be all right. And that was just one of those odd, all right, well, tacked out on there because he clearly takes his time to put it in here. Doesn't explain why, and that was the best logic I could come up with. You might speculate other things. Have at it. I just don't have a better way of coming up with a better answer. So, the question, why all these things? Daniel 12 really, really helps draw this timeline. And this is just a few chapters into Daniel. We haven't even touched into Zechariah or Isaiah, Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians, Revelation. We haven't touched any of those yet. But Daniel 12 goes out of its way to add days. But there's one other text that adds days before we can get to the New Testament. And that is Daniel 8. Daniel 8 does something, again, odd. If you go to Daniel 8 is a somewhat stranger vision. And I won't read through the whole thing because there's really a key point that I want to get here, and we don't have that much time. But in verse 9, it's been speaking about this back and forth between nations, the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks, and this back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And in verse 9, speaking of a bunch of horns or kings, out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and towards the beautiful land, which presumably would be the land of Israel. Now see if this sounds familiar. It grew up to the host of heaven, and it caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down, and it even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host. And it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. Again, anchor point, all right? Verse 11, or verse 12. And on the account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and will perform its will and prosper. And then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that. This conversation between angels is an interesting overlap, because it happened in Daniel 12, it happens in Revelation, and it happens here. He overhears them talking. And so one angel is saying to another angel, how long, not do all of these things occur, but how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? And notice the way the answer is given. And here's another one of those singular numbers that you see once. And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, or 2,300 days, and then the holy place will be properly restored. And then you can read the rest of the book, and it talks about how this little horn is a king, and he will arise in the latter period of the ruler, and that this pertains to the end. But it was that 2,300 days. Now, if we do our math again, it talks about from when the regular sacrifice is cut off. So we add that, 2,300 days. Again, notice where it stops short. It's not reaching to the end. Now, this one isn't quite as specific. It doesn't say that you're blessed if you make it this far, but I still thought this one was fascinating, because the holy place is not speaking about heaven, because heaven wasn't defiled. Okay, so what else would the holy place be referring to? Well, the temple, Holy of Holies, you have the holy place, you have the sanctuary, right? This has been mentioned in Daniel repeatedly. So what does it mean when it's talking about this? Well, once again, let's do math. So if you take these three chunks of time, 1,260 days, 30 days, and 3.5 years, or put them into days, you get a total of 2,550 days. That math means that from the time the sacrifice is removed until the end of the Great Tribulation, there is exactly 2,550 days. I don't think stretching anything. I'm just taking what we already have from other texts and just putting some basic numbers together. And so, the reason I did this math, though, is because I wanted to know, okay, so how far does 2,300 days fall in, and how much time is left? So from the time that the holy place is restored, how many days do you have left before the end of the Great Tribulation? Well, if you do the math, you subtract, and then you get your number. It's 250 days left. It's not a lot of time. It's not a short amount of time. So that begs another speculative question. What's happening there? What is going on there that this would need to be mentioned? And I will build on this a little later, but my best guess as to this is at this point when Israel begins to turn around. Because why else would the holy place be restored? So we know why it was defiled. The king of the north goes in and he just sets up the abomination, he cuts off the sacrifice, and he exalts himself, or as Paul will add in 2 Thessalonians, he sits in the temple and declares himself to be God. So we know how the holy place was defiled, but why is it being restored before the Great Tribulation is over? Well, if you read Revelation, you'll notice an interesting event, or a change of events that starts to go down towards the latter part of the book. And we'll add to this when we get to Revelation, but you might call it Armageddon, which refers to the timeline that Zechariah 12 talks about, which we will also get into a little later. Zechariah 12 talks about the Jews turning around and how they do it, and the order in which they do it, by house and so on. But that doesn't happen until the latter part of all these things going down. And we'll add to that a little later. But just a little fun thought, 250 days, I think that's where that's going to apply. But let's get to Matthew 24. And we've read through Matthew 24 time and time and time and time again. You should know what it says by now, but you know that when you see the abomination of desolation, then there will be a great tribulation. Everyone who is in Judea should get out of Dodge, get out of town, because then there will be a great tribulation. Again, using the same wording, such has never occurred. This is unprecedented. And so Christ adds to this by saying that when you see that abomination of desolation, and what do we read in parentheses there? As spoken of through Daniel. So Daniel's now mentioned the abomination a few times, and Christ is now adding to it. So again, there's our primary anchoring point. Christ is effectively telling us, almost verbatim, exactly where to anchor what he's talking about in Matthew 24. He doesn't just say, hey, when you see an abomination that happens to make desolate. He says, no, when you see the abomination of desolation, just like Daniel talked about, then you are to know, just like our Daniel 12 said, there will be an unprecedented time of distress or tribulation. So we now know at what point Christ is talking about. And using that logic, we can backfill some of the other information. Because what does he say before that? You will hear of wars and rumors of wars and famines and earthquakes in various places, and persecution and lawlessness increasing, and the love of many grows cold, and the gospel is being preached to all the nations, or the ethnos, or the peoples. And when the gospel has been finished being preached to all the types of peoples, then the end will come. And so all of those built up to the abomination. So we can use those, and we can try to speculate as to what parts of those applied before it. So if that happens all before the abomination, and you read Daniel 11, you'll notice a lot of conflicts between kings, wars. Now, Christ doesn't refer to those specifically. He just says you'll be hearing about wars and rumors of wars. But it's just interesting to see some of those things start to incidentally overlap. Those will be secondary, maybe tertiary anchor points. They seem to be implied. And so the question can be asked, why? Why does Jesus not mention the regular sacrifice? He never makes mention of that. He never makes mention of a lot of the things Daniel talks about, even Michael, the archangel arising. All he talks about is the abomination and some general points, and then he goes into the Great Tribulation very briefly, and then the second coming and the resurrection, something that Daniel also alludes to. And a little clarifier, Daniel also refers to the second coming of Christ. It happens in Daniel 7, is when he refers to that. So, in Matthew 24. Now let's get cooperates. 2 Thessalonians 2. 2 Thessalonians 2 does something very interesting. Note what Paul does not say in 2 Thessalonians. Because what's the question at hand to the Thessalonians? What answer or what problem is he answering there? Well, how do you know the day of the Lord hasn't come? We've been hearing all these reports that the day of the Lord has already come. It's already here. It may already have been passed. In fact, there's a certain group of theologians who make that claim even to this day. So the issue was, has the day of the Lord come? Is it here? Is it past? Is it over with? Did we miss it? It's bothering them. This is a recurring theme with the Thessalonians, because if you remember in the first epistle, they were afraid that the people who had died would miss the resurrection, would miss the second coming. And here in 2 Thessalonians, they had heard forged reports that the day of the Lord was already here. Maybe they heard about what was going on in Jerusalem, and they thought, oh, this must be it. Just a little fun thought there. But that's the question he's answering. So what does Paul say? The day of the Lord will not come until the regular sacrifice is abolished after the 7-year covenant, halfway through it, and the abomination of desolation. Doesn't say any of that. It doesn't make any mention of any of those things. And that always bothered me. Why doesn't Paul say abomination of desolation? If the man of lawlessness sitting in the temple of God is the same thing, then why not just say it? I mean, Paul is being very specific. You read that text, he says, it will not come unless the apostasy comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, who sits himself in the temple of God and declares himself to be God. What he's saying is until those things happen, the day of the Lord will not begin. And so that, of course, was interesting because then if you backfill some of the information, he then proceeds to go on and explain that this man of lawlessness coming will be in accord with the activity of Satan. But we can backfill it in, and this is what he says will lead up to it. Speaking of the apostasy, the activity of Satan with all signs and wonders, and then God will send a deluding influence to make them who did not receive the love of the truth so as to be saved, and they will believe what is false. And so this is what he says precedes that, which fits with what Matthew 24 had talked about earlier, about Christian persecution, and you'll be hearing of false Christs, and there will be many of them, and false prophets, and don't let them lead you astray, because if possible, even the elect, and so you can see how the apostasy starts to tie in. And so you can, again, use this sort of info to backfill some of the information. But it does beg the question, why does Paul not mention those other things? Why not bring up the abomination? Why not bring up the sacrifice? Why not bring up the 7-year covenant? Well, who was he talking to? So in Matthew 24, who was Jesus talking to? He's talking to the disciples. And he refers to those who are in Judea. And he is looking at the temple. He's local. So when those who are in Judea see the abomination of desolation, get out, because the Great Tribulation is about to kick off. Now, if the Great Tribulation starts at the exact moment of the abomination of desolation, why would he tell them until that point? Seems like you're out of time. Unless there's a small opening. There's a small window of time. Because he says, when you see the abomination of desolation, those who are in Judea should get out. Don't turn around, don't go back, get out. You have a very small opening. Because then, after you have had your opportunity to get out, there will be great tribulation. They're not immediate, there's this very, very small gap. And that I thought was interesting, because that would explain why Paul, when answering the question, when does the day of the Lord begin? When does the great tribulation begin? He doesn't say abomination, he answers the exact thing that actually begins it. The abomination immediately precedes it. But right after that comes the Great Tribulation. And that's why Paul's answering their question very precisely as to why he mentions that and not the abomination or sacrifice. Because he's not answering what are the signs of all the things. Just how do we know the day of the Lord hasn't begun yet? So, bring up some of that. Now going into Revelation. Revelation is very dense. But if you'll notice, as we'll get into in a second here, Revelation doesn't include a lot of things. But Revelation does include the seals. And I generally, and as I've talked about ad nauseum, or the reason I put the 6th seal here is, sixth seal is broken, and the people of the earth run away, and they hide themselves under the mountains and the cliffs. And what do they say? Hide us from the presence of the one who sits on the throne and from the Lamb. Why? Because the great day of their wrath has come, or the day of the Lord has come. That sort of specific terminology is not used any point up to that point in Revelation. And so, because Revelation makes no mention of the abomination, it makes no mention of the regular sacrifice, it makes very little, it makes implied mentions of the man of lawlessness. It doesn't really directly refer to him. The only place I could find to put it was the place that the world clearly tells us what's going on, and it's also at that point that things get so bad, so specifically, that it seems pretty apparent. So I put that there. But you'll notice, as I mentioned, why aren't these other things mentioned? And I think there's a couple of reasons you could speculate as to that. But one is, as I've mentioned before, what is the perspective of Revelation? Daniel spends most of his time looking at the nations, looking at the kings. That's why you have beasts and horns over and over and over and over again. Matthew 24 speaks to the disciples in Judea, or those in Judea, and what they're supposed to do when they see the abomination, and then what your attitude's supposed to be. Paul is answering the Gentile church that was located well outside of the local area, what would be in modern-day Turkey, and answering as to how they know the day of the Lord has begun and what happens to kick it off. But Revelation is the most densely packed book of information regarding the same subject. And it comes from the perspective from the top down. It is a very unique perspective that almost nobody else gets to see, and that's from the perspective of heaven. So it's explaining what God is doing to make these things happen. So Revelation is best understood when you have understood everything else that came before it. There's a good reason why it's put at the end of the book. And yet too many people start there, and that's why it doesn't make an awful lot of sense. But Daniel's already given us hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, a basis to work from. Christ then builds off of it in multiple places, and then Paul builds off of it, and Paul refers to it, and Peter refers to it, and then you get into other epistles, and then you get into Revelation, and they all are building off the same thing. And so when you put everything together, you get all of this. And again, this is a very condensed, very bare bones version of this sort of chart. But you can use it to look down, and you can kind of see from the top down, all right, here's what happens, and we know the day of the Lord is on this side of it, and then on this side of it, there's the precursors. But then this all begs a question. All right, knowing everything we know here, what do we actually see? What do if I pull open my phone, what am I supposed to be looking for? And Paul's answer to the Thessalonians is so disappointing. Because if you were to take an assessment of what we were actually told we would see, unfortunately, about half the chart disappears. Paul never refers to any of those things as things that are visible, except the man of lawlessness. He was answering the question as to how you know the day of the Lord has begun. Very little mention of the others. Even the activity of Satan is kind of vague. You could describe that at any point in history. And Christ says, when you see the abomination, those who are in Judea should flee. So we know that's pretty visible. And so at first this might be discouraging. Like, all right, well then why give us all that? Why tell us all these specifics if most of it's useless for me? And this is one of my biggest problems with modern day exposition, is we think it has nothing to do with me, and it's not relevant, and I don't have to care about it. But if that were true, you could write off most of Chronicles. You could certainly write off a lot of the genealogies, and you could write off different parts of the Gospels that didn't really apply to you. And you could write off all kinds of things. Some people have even written the entire Sermon on the Mount off, because they didn't think it was directly applicable to them. And that is not how we exposit Scripture, and that is not how we explain things. Just because it's not directly applicable to me right here, right now, does not mean it's not useful. But before we get into the answer to that question as to why it's so vague, I just wanted to quickly show how these texts overlap. And if you'll notice, certain things are repeated over and over and over again. And again, this is not all of the texts. These are just some of them that show how things overlap. And so if you'll notice, Daniel 12 refers to the abomination, the sacrifice being stopped, the day of the Lord, and the great distress. He refers to the return of Christ and the resurrection, more specifically the resurrection. Daniel 7 also refers to it. Daniel 9 refers to the abomination, the sacrifice stopping, the 7-year covenant. But if you notice, the 7-year covenant thing here is only mentioned once. And there's no other book of the Bible that mentions it. But we all know of a certain category of theology that makes a very big deal out of that one reference. But my point of this is to say, it's a good rule of exposition. Major on what it majors on, and minor on what it minors on. And what does it major on? Sacrifice being cut off, repeated over and over. Abomination of desolation, repeated over and over. The king of the north, or the little horn, magnifying himself to be equal with God, over and over. Even Paul makes reference to that. Those are big points. Little points, secondary points, okay, they're helpful to make sense of what's happening around them, but they're not the most important parts. But this is just to show how some of the things overlap. But if you notice, all these hot-button topics, if you were a scholar of the Old Testament prophecies and even had your hands on some of the things Jesus had said and some of the apostles, you may have been very disappointed to get Revelation. Because if you notice, again, Revelation only refers to the day of the Lord, when the people are lamenting it, and of the return of Christ and the resurrection. Any mention of the other stuff? It does make mention of the beast later in it, but doesn't mention the covenant, doesn't mention the sacrifices, the abomination. But maybe that's because it's building into some other point. So, going back to our chart, first thing we're going to do is we're going to simplify this thing. We'll come back to the complicated version, but if you were to do what I mentioned earlier, to have all your primary and secondary anchoring points, now we can condense it, just to try to give ourselves a simple roadmap, and that looks like that. It's very simple. We know, that little popping sound effect, I'm sorry, that was instinctive. I have kids. We know the basis of these things now. So now, rather than spending all of our time trying to prove the same thing over and over again, now we can just ask the question, what happens? And we have lots of specifics. We know how long the whole thing takes. Well, we know at what point different things take. And we know when certain major events occur. So when you read different texts and you see hot button topics, you can think, okay, at least we have an idea of where we're looking here. Now we're getting into another fun topic. And I'm going to try to go through this one relatively quickly because I don't want to push the limits too much. But the Antichrist. There's a fun topic. Maybe he's some head of the UN. Maybe he's some great king who makes everyone does what he says. Maybe all the world loves him. What is this Antichrist? And I'm not going to go into immense detail on this right now, but I'm going to make a couple quick points. What's the difference between the man of lawlessness, or the king of the north, the little horn, the Antichrist, and the beast from the sea? Well, what makes them... Are they all the same? Is there any difference between them? If I said the Antichrist, most people think 666, ruler of the world, devil's right-hand man. If I said man of lawlessness, all right, well, it's probably the Antichrist. If I said the little horn, most people probably have no idea what I'm referring to. Well, if I say the beast, that's the Antichrist. Well, let's break down their different references. The man of lawlessness is a series of actions that you can spot him with. He exalts himself excessively. This guy is just as proud of himself as he can be. I will add, he does not show all of this. He does not show the height of his ego until he sits in the temple and declares himself to be God. So you would expect to see different hints of this, though not directly up front. He exalts himself not just as a god, he exalts himself above all the idols and declares himself to be the God of the Bible. So he's not just some pagan here. He is responsible for the abomination of desolation, so he is the one who gives the order in Daniel 11 to get it set up. And he always dies the same way. If you read in Daniel 12, the horn that's referenced there. If you read in Daniel 8, it's alluded to. In Daniel 12, it's alluded to. Or end of Daniel 11, it's alluded to. He is never killed by a human being. He is never killed by another nation beating him. It constantly references as, and he will come to his end, and there will be no one to help him. And he is killed, though not in battle, nor in war. He meets an end when the Son of Man appears there in Daniel 7. So he always has the same outcome. So if you're wondering, is this the man of lawlessness? Well, look for those basic signs. He is called the man of lawlessness. He is called the son of perdition or destruction. And that would be 2 Thessalonians 2. He is called the little horn. That shows up repeatedly. Daniel 7, Daniel 8, and Revelation 13. The king of the north is what he's called in Daniel 11 there. And there's a whole bunch of references. Again, if you want versions of these charts, I can give them to you. They're PDFs. It doesn't take a lot to do that. But he's referenced in Daniel 7, Daniel 7, verse 8, 11, 12, 20 to 22, 24 to 26, referenced Daniel 8, 9, 11, 2 Thessalonians 2, and Revelation, or 13. So he's referenced in a few different places. Antichrist. Well, we only ever have him referenced in one place. That would be John's epistles. He appears in the last hour. He denies that Jesus is the Christ, so we get an idea of his theology. Now, why would he deny Jesus is the Christ? Because he just likes arguing against theology? No, because he has a reason. He's trying to create a void so he can fill it. He's trying to say, actually, Jesus was not the Christ. I've got your answer. Now, this would explain why, when Jesus references in Matthew 24, you will be seeing all kinds of, not false deities, false Christs. People trying to fill that gap. He denies the Father and the Son, and he was already in the world in John's day. The spirit of Antichrist was already at work. Many Antichrists have already shown up. Many replacement Christs have already gone out. He's called the spirit of error, spirit of Antichrist. He who is in the world, a deluding influence. He's called the deceiver. These are some references that I could find making reference to him, or seems to be making reference to him. And he's referenced primarily in 1 and 2 John. In 1 Timothy 4, it actually seems to briefly allude. It says that the people in the latter times, there will be a falling away, and they will be paying attention to the doctrines of demons, which I thought was an interesting reference, but that might be referring generally, but I thought was interesting. And finally, the beast from the sea, or the beast. The mark of the beast, our favorite villain there. He is revealed at the start of the Great Tribulation. There will be a reference as to how long his reign goes, and it says in Revelation 13 that he will be given authority for 42 months, which is 3.5 years. He must be summoned by the dragon, so that he doesn't show up. He's not revealed for what it is until the dragon is cast out of heaven and can't get at Israel. He rules the nations for 42 months. He's the one who requires the mark, the beast from the earth enforces it, and he gets the world to follow him in marveling at him and his signs. He is called the beast, or the scarlet beast, or the northern kingdom. These are the general references I could find, and he's referenced in Daniel 7, 11, 19, 23, and repeatedly in Revelation. So, breaking down the differences, my answer as to what they are, the Antichrist is likely, I think, there's a word for spirit, is used frequently of the Spirit of God, is often referenced in the spirit of error versus the spirit of truth. The term that's used, the same Greek word that is used for the Spirit of God, is used repeatedly when John is writing about this. So I think you could, with relative safety, assume that this is not just a theology of Antichrist, because it refers to it as a personification, he who is in the world. And you can say, well, maybe that's the devil, but the devil's never mentioned in that text. So it's likely he was in the world, is responsible for the creation and spread of false Christianity, which is how he could be at work already in John's day. Versus the man of lawlessness, this would be the vessel. Similar to how Judas was also called the son of destruction, or the son of perdition, he's given the same title. And what does Judas do? Judas had two primary functions: to betray Christ, and then at the end, when he was going to accomplish that goal, the devil entered him. He was quite literally possessed. So he goes out and he does what he does. Same way, I think the man of lawlessness serves the same function. That he is already a pretty bad guy, and so the spirit, as it were, at the very least the idea of antichristum, fills him up, and he is the embodiment of this whole thing. Of all the false Christs that have ever come, he is the peak. He is called the son of destruction, he's the vessel that it fills, he's the personification, and he has yet to come. Otherwise, he'd be really old. Because if John was referring to him as already being there 2,000 years ago, then we're looking for a very old guy, and I don't know what to tell you there. A beast from the sea, beasts, as we've talked about before, almost always refer to a nation. Daniel sets that rule already up, and Revelation continues the theme, in Revelation 17 more specifically. But there's a little paradox there, because it also talks about how the beast is thrown into the lake of fire with the false prophet. Now, does that mean he's throwing an entire nation? Well, at a certain point, Revelation starts to personify or change terminology regarding the beast. Speaks of it as an individual. So I think that it is representative of a nation, and this is where I'm going to have one of my wild theories, and you're free to disagree with me, though I'd like a better answer. But the best way I've been able to make sense of it so far, as to how you can have something represent a nation, but also act as a personification of something that moves and has character and does things and is held responsible for things, is to say, is it a nation? Is it a demon? Maybe the answer is yes. It's to both. Think of it like a glove. It's my best illustration I can give. The glove is the nation. You have the heads and the horns, and they represent the different parts of the different nations that are being referenced, which Daniel and Revelation both clearly go out of their way to say. But as to how you could blame a collective nation and punish it, like in the way it happens there and the way it's personified, what if it's also possessed? And we already know that you can have, say, legion, an entire bunch of demons possess one person. So I don't think it's out of left field to say that the beast could also represent what the spirit of Antichrist might look like. Now again, this is secondary. I'm not going to die on that one. But I do think it is, to me, the most practical explanation behind why the wording is the way it is. And then you have the dragon. The dragon is not any of these. It's the devil. We are clearly told it is the serpent. It is the devil. He's the one who calls on the beast and gets him out of the sea. And unlike the beast, what's funny to me is the beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire before anybody else, even the devil. Fun little fact there. So what's our takeaway from this point? While they're very similar, they don't appear to be referring to exactly the same person. They're very close to each other, but they don't appear to be exactly referring to the same person just because of the discrepancies in how they're used as titles. So there's just a fun little quick lesson in Antichrist mythology. Next, time times and half time versus 42 months versus 3.5 years, 1,260 days. Wanted to quickly go over this because it is an interesting, I think, topic. How long is the Great Tribulation, and how do you know? We've already gone over this as to when they're reference textualized, but time times and half a time is an interesting one. Now, this will answer one of our questions I brought up earlier as to why the 250 days after the holy place is restored. Time times and half a time is used in, quite literally, just means a year, 2 years, and half a year, or 3.5 years. It is used in Daniel 7, it is used in Daniel 12, and it is used in Revelation 12. And at no other point is it used. It is used to describe the length of time of the reign of the beast in Daniel 7. So the fourth beast that shows up, he's given authority over times and seasons and laws for 8 times and half a time, and then he will be destroyed. It is also the same length of time that the woman is kept safe from the presence of the dragon in Revelation 12. She is, after the dragon is kicked out of heaven, the dragon pursues the woman, and she is brought to her place to be kept safe for 8 times and half a time. 1,260 days, never directly a number given. Like I mentioned earlier, you're not going to find it if you search it. It's just a number used to make sense of 1,290 days. It's just half a year. And then 42 months is only ever used in 2 texts. Revelation 11, talking about the Gentiles trampling underfoot the court of the Gentiles in Jerusalem. And Revelation 13, the length of the authority of the beast. He's given authority for 42 months, which is also 3.5 years. So these two are references, and they always appear at the same general points. They always appear on this side of the abomination of desolation. Now, this is what I thought was interesting, because again, you have 3 chunks of time, right? So you have 1,260 days, so that's 3.5 years, 3.5 years, 3.5 years. So you have 3 different candidates that you can always have to put into consideration as to what's being referenced. So how do we tell them apart? So if the woman, which seems to represent Israel, is taken to be kept safe from the devil, and she's brought to her place of safety for 3.5 years, which of those 3 chunks is it talking about? And how would we know? Well, this is where it gets fun. Lion of lawlessness has his power and the length of great tribulation for 8 times and half a time. And the time the woman is kept safe is times and half a time. It uses that very specific way of describing the same length of time. And you could say, well, maybe that's just how John describes 3.5 years. But John, the very next chapter, refers to 42 months, which is the exact same length of time. So why refer to the same length of time 2 different ways from the same author in the same general section? Unless you're trying to differentiate them from each other. Or make a very specific point as to which one you're talking about. And so, she's kept in her place, safe, in, I think, the Great Tribulation. So that begs the question, how is she safe? This is the Great Tribulation, Jacob's trouble, what's going on? Well, again, I mentioned Zechariah 12 earlier, and if you read it, you'll see that it's towards the latter period. So Zechariah has already lamented a lot of stuff that seems like it's already gone down in the Great Tribulation. Fire and locusts and terrible things going on. And then he talks about half the city being taken and 2/3 of the Jews being killed. And they're surrounded by the nations. All the nations have gathered against Jerusalem for battle. And it's at that point that the Jews begin to turn to their Messiah. And I think that reference to the holy place being restored, in the 250 days, I think is narrowing down exactly what point that begins to start to happen. Take this tiny little slice. It is around this point the nations have begun to push. So at the end of 250 days, after the Jews have decided to restore the holy place, you can speculate on politics. The man of lawlessness takes the temple, takes the holy place, renovates it, says, I'm going to sit there, I'm going to declare myself to be God. And then at that place, when that time the holy place is restored, the Jews effectively come in and say, no, we're done with this. You're out. They restore the holy place. They kick out the abomination of desolation, the man of lawlessness, and they start to turn it around. That doesn't mean they've repented yet, but they're starting to. And then, towards the latter period, is at that point you see the nation starting to gather against Jerusalem. Now, that would take a little bit. In fact, it seems to me that it takes approximately 250 days, and so it would be my theory that it is at this point Israel begins to turn their hearts. Not completely, but they're starting to. They're still being purged and refined and so on. And so this would explain why there's still 250 days left. Why the holy place is restored, but it's not done. Because the Jews are starting to turn, but they're not all in yet. So that would leave this very narrow slice of time. Because if you remember, and I've mentioned this before, God had promised to Israel that even despite all of their rebellions, that the moment they would turn and repent, right as they would do that, even when surrounded by their enemies, the moment they would repent, he would come back to save them. And so it would make sense that there's this shifting of the tide, and at the moment they finally are beaten back, they're surrounded, they've lost most of the city, they've lost 2/3 of their people, they are backed into a corner, and it happens very quickly, that they suddenly repent. And at the moment they repent, Son of Man returns. And it is a very narrow slice of time. Times and half a time is the length the woman is kept safe. The woman is Israel, and then she is kept safe for the duration of the Great Tribulation. But the moment that ends, she's no longer safe. And she immediately comes under siege and starts falling behind massively. So this basically is to say that as far as I can tell, having gone over this quite a few times, the time it takes for Israel to be backed into the corner to the point of repentance is very fast. They lose a lot of people very quickly. And finally, to end, signs of the times, what do we look for? Right? We can make this chart. What about the no man knows the day or the hour? Well, first of all, I can point out it says day and hour, not year and month, but you can have fun with that one. But Jesus said immediately after the tribulation, immediately after the tribulation, Christ would come, right? Well, he doesn't quite say that. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. That happens immediately after. Things get pitch black. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man come in the clouds with great power and glory, and he gathers together the elect. So again, very quick sequence of events. But the first thing that immediately happens is not the return of Christ, it's the stars and the sun and the moon going dark. Lights are shut off. Now we already know through Revelation they're beginning darker already at this point. At this point everything is pitch black. Israel is now pushed into a corner. They're starting to repent. The world's going dark. It's like the calm before the storm, but not for us. So what about the day of the hour? Well, we know at this point, at the very last moment, these sequence of events happen. How long does that take? I don't know how many days. Could be 1 day, could be 5 days, could be 7 days, could be 30. I don't know exactly. Could be less than a day. I don't know what hour it occurs. Could be in the morning, could be in the evening. I still don't know the answer to the question. So, there's that, but here's some other signs. Wars, rumors of wars, natural disasters, we've already gone over these, persecution. You could also speculate on the other things. Desires for deals, covenants to solve problems. You could say, all right, collections of nations. Like the beast, and the whole idea is a uniquely modern thing to collectively put these nations into one governing body. Started with the League of Nations, you get to the UN, the NATO, newly developed BRICS. These collection of nations are an interesting new development. But I think, among all these different signs as to what you could look for, you'll notice that none of them are uber specific. They could be happening days, hours, months, years, any length of time. They're signs like birth pangs, but on their own, they're not enough. They're just signs that something is happening. So we do have things to look for. And we will see ripples of the 7-year covenant, of the sacrifice being cut off, of the temple being built. But I'm not convinced that we will see them. Might see hints of them. But if we knew for sure we were going to see them, then we would have been told that. But that doesn't mean there aren't things to look for, and that's why I wanted to draw up a nice big list of these things. And so, this is how you have the paradox. Just like with the first coming, tons of specifics, but you don't know when they specifically apply. Christ would be born in Bethlehem. You don't know when. But exactly when he was supposed to be born, at that moment, he was born. But only Mary, Joseph, and the shepherds knew about it. It wasn't until a couple years later the wise men would show up. And even they came from, apparently, likely Babylon, and how in the world they knew is anyone's guess. Most other people didn't know. But it still happened. Well, they didn't see everything. But it still happened. And it's that sort of paradox, and this is why I think it keeps things interesting. Because then we can end with, be on the alert. You still don't know the day or the hour. You don't know when he's coming. He will come when you do not think he will. So here's my point of encouragement. You can say, all right, well, we have all these specifics. Well, they're not happening. And if they're going to happen, then I expect to see them. And if they're not happening now, then he's not coming anytime soon. And therefore, this text doesn't really apply to us. Well, that's why I wanted to make a point of all the things you're not told you'll see. For all I know, and I guarantee you would not have a way to prove me wrong, 7-year covenant could already be in effect. Sacrifices could be underway. I mean, considering the political environment, it makes sense they would hide it. Holy place. Well, there's no temple. Well, last I checked, the first iteration of the holy place was not the temple. It was the tabernacle. It was portable. You could pack it up and move it around. That's the whole point. The Holy of Holies started in a tent, not a building. So there's all kinds of ways that things could happen and you have no idea. And it will come in an hour when you don't think it will. And I think that wording directly points us to it's going to happen, and it's going to happen specifically, but not in front of you. But know that it's happening. That the exact plan is going down exactly like it said it would. Plus, the coming of the Lord. Well, You don't know when he's coming, so it must be referring to exactly the moment he comes through the clouds. Well, when I say the day of the Lord or the second coming, I'm referring to everything that comes with it. The day of the Lord is not just him coming in the clouds, it's everything in tandem with it. The Great Tribulation and the events that set it up and the trumpets and the bowls of wrath, all of these happen in the day of the Lord. So even if you say, well, I don't know the day or the hour, I don't even know the day or hour when these things begin. So all of that to say, don't worry about it. Revelation of Jesus Christ and the day of the Lord clearly refer not just to his coming in the clouds, but all of the events leading up to it, everything tied to it. That's why we're getting all these details about it, which is why it's compared to birth pangs. You will see plenty of signs. You're just not sure which one exactly you're looking at there. So, went a little longer than I intended to, but I got through 68 slides, so I will pat myself on the back on that one. And again, I have versions of these charts if you want them. This is years of my life put into this sort of thing, and I have so much more to go. But when I hear of wars and rumors of wars and Israel's north pushing them just this morning, rockets and explosions and pagers and all kinds of interesting stuff, I mean, the fact that Israel exists should be enough for us to go, we got to be pretty close. It's a Jewish state, more Jews living there than any point since they were exiled out. Worth a thought. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for the specifics that you do give, but also the hope that we are not the ones in charge of this, that it's not up to us to make these things happen, that it is your will and your command that will bring your enemies as a footstool under your feet, and not ours. I thank you that we do not have to be the ones to usher in the kingdom, but that your guarantee will, and that all of the things you said would happen will happen. I thank you that we don't have to be at the forefront because we're not the ones driving this, and that we get to trust the one who is. And so I ask that we trust both what we have been given as well as what is yet to happen, and that we look forward to it with the appropriate mindset, that everything is going to happen as you said it would happen. I thank you for the hope that you've given that can function even today and tomorrow and for however long we have left. I thank you for these things in Jesus' name. Amen.